Today we're starting a 3-part series on kidding management, how a system actually works, why it matters, which genetics you're running, and how to build an approach that fits your operation. Part 1 is the story of how our kidding system evolved, from show goats and January barn kidding in 20 below weather, through commercial Boers, and then the moment the Spanish goats arrived and showed me something I hadn't seen coming. Let's get to it. Hey there, welcome to GoatWise. I'm Millie Bradshaw, animal scientist and rancher. Here we talk meat goats, feeding strategies, goat fencing, and livestock management that holds up in real life. If you care about raising goats well and building systems that actually work, you're in the right place. Let's talk livestock. If this podcast has been helpful, the best thing you can do right now is leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Scroll down to ratings and reviews, tap the stars, leave a few sentences. It helps more serious livestock producers find the show, and I read every one of them. And while you're at it, grab the free kidding due date chart at goatwise.com/kidding-chart. That also gets you on the insider email list, which is where I share things I'm not putting on the podcast. The link is in the show notes. Here's what's happening on the ranch. Stacy and Sage took off for a long weekend to the Jordan Valley Big Loop in Oregon. It's becoming an annual tradition for them, and it's great fun for them to see people they know and spend time with folks who love the same life we do. It's not always easy to get Stacy to step away from the fence business for a few days, so I was glad he went and got a little breathing room from here. While they were gone, Ray and I took over electric fence moves, livestock chores, all of it. We got into a pretty good groove with it, and I'll be honest, that was a good thing for me because I spend more time in the office than I probably should sometimes, and those days out with the goats reminded me how much I like being down there. They've been out on grass for 4 weeks now, and they are looking really good. Mineral consumption is right where I'd expect it to be on fresh grass. The official start of kidding is about 2 weeks out, and the plan is to move them into the kidding pasture in a week. We want them settled in there and comfortable before the first doe's kid, not still adjusting to a new area when things kick off. My dad stopped by over the weekend, which was good. We walked through the pastures together, and he talked about what he was seeing. He's been a big influence in range management with big herds of cattle, and he knows what this place used to look like. So when he said he was impressed with how it's coming along, that was great. It's fun to talk with him about how goats fit into the larger regenerative picture. He thinks in terms of big cow herds, and I think in terms of goats, and targeted grazing and smaller acreage, and somewhere in the middle of that conversation, there's usually something useful. I'll take the encouragement either way. All right, let's talk about kidding systems. But to get there, I have to go back, pretty far back, because I think the evolution of how I do things now only makes sense if you understand where it started and how much I had to unlearn along the way. If you've been here long, you know we started with show goats. And show goats, in our world, meant January and February kidding, which in our part of Utah, near the Wyoming border, means you are regularly looking at 20 degrees below zero. You're not kidding on pasture in those conditions. That is not a viable option. You are barn kidding because there is no other choice, and you're managing every single detail of that process because the weather demands it. The system looked like this. Every doe went into a kidding pen when she was close. If she kidded out before we got her in, we'd move her and her kids into a pen as quickly as we could. They'd stay in there for 2 to 3 days, sometimes longer, until we felt like they were stable enough and bonded enough to go back out into the herd. And even then, you were watching. When we had our place in town, it was actually a pretty workable setup because we had a heated garage with pens built out in it. Not glamorous, but the kids had time to get up, get warm, get going, and get bonded before they ever had to face the cold outside. I'd take that over 20 below any day. The does were comfortable, the kids had a fighting chance from the start, and we could monitor everything. Then we moved off grid. No heated garage. That changed the math pretty fast. What we ended up doing was taking the kids away from the doe right after birth, getting them into a calf warmer until they were warm and dry, tubing them with colostrum from their mom, and then trying to get them mothered back up once they were stable and warm. It worked, and it was the best option we had at the time. The does were usually willing to take their kids back, not a lot of drama in most cases. And getting colostrum into them fast and getting them warm and dry is what kept kids alive in those conditions. That part of the protocol was sound. But it did disrupt the mothering. It just did. You pull a kid off a doe right at birth, even temporarily, and you're working against the bonding process that nature built in. We managed it, but I will tell you, looking back now, we were lucky that those show goats were not the most aggressively maternal animals we've raised. Because if we had done that same protocol on our Spanish does, I think the outcome would have been a very different story. Those does would have had a much harder time accepting their kids back, and we'd have been fighting that battle one at a time. And prophylactic antibiotics. Every kid got a dose. That was just part of the program, non-negotiable, because the conditions were what they were. Bitter cold, the does and kids cohabitating in the barn in close quarters, moving through the same winter areas outside, wet, confined. Even when you're doing your best to keep things clean and dry, you've got a lot of animals in a small space during the worst months of the year. That is a breeding ground for sickness to spread. The system was generating the disease pressure that the antibiotics were treating. I knew that, I just didn't see another option, and that was how you did it. This was the standard. You kid in January, you give every kid a prophylactic dose, you manage it intensively, you watch everything closely. That's what raising show goats looked like. Commercial Boers came in 1 year after the show goats, and we just fit them into the system we already had. We moved kidding to a different time of year, March through June at various points because we were trying to find the right timing. We shuffled it around the calendar quite a bit, but we didn't really change the approach. And honestly, those Boers were probably fine in that system. They came from barn-kidded herds. They'd been managed intensively for generations. We were still doing what people in our area told you was the standard approach, and nothing about those Boer years looked like we were doing something wrong. It just looked like typical livestock management for lambs or goats in this area. And then the Spanish goats joined the herd 4 years later. That was a real eye-opener, though not in the way I was expecting. We were already leaning toward less intervention and lower inputs, but the Spanish goats had a lesson for us that we couldn't ignore. Every Spanish doe that we took into the barn, we had problems getting her to mother. Every single one. And my first reaction, if I'm being honest, was to wonder what was wrong with these goats. What is it about this breed, this animal, that's making this harder? They came from strong maternal lines. Why was this not working? And then the light came on, and once it did, I couldn't unsee it. Nothing was wrong with the goats. The system was the problem. The Spanish does didn't see the barn as a safe place to have their kids. They saw it as a threat. And when an animal is stressed, when instinct is telling her she's in danger, survival takes over, and the bonding that happens in those first minutes after birth gets disrupted. That whole process that nature designed to happen in a quiet, secluded, low-pressure environment, we were trying to engineer it inside a building that those does wanted absolutely nothing to do with. They panicked. And you cannot force a Spanish doe to mother a kid when she's in full alarm mode. It doesn't work that way. We were trying to help them and protect them, and we were doing the opposite. That was when I started asking a different question. Instead of, how do we get these goats to work in our system? We started asking, what system do these goats actually need to thrive? And once you flip that question around, you start seeing things differently. So here's what we actually had, laid out all at once. Show goats that required intensive management because of weather and January confinement. Commercial Boers that had been barn kitted for so many generations that a lot of the instinct just wasn't there anymore. And then these Spanish does that were telling us plainly through their behavior and their stress response and their flat refusal to conform that a completely different approach was possible, that they were built to do something we hadn't been asking of them. We decided to let all of the commercial goats pasture kid, including the Boers, and that was a very interesting thing to watch, because some of those does genuinely looked a little uncertain about what was expected of them. Like they were waiting for the barn doors to open. Some of them found a secluded spot and figured it out on their own, just followed instinct, had their kids, did the whole thing without us being involved. That was great to see. But some of them had their kids right by the barn doors, just standing there, wanting in. And that told us something important, because the does that wanted in were the ones whose lines had been asked to be brought in for so long and being accommodated for so long that the capacity to do it differently had pretty well been bred out of them. And we had to decide, do we keep accommodating that or do we select against it? We culled based on it. We were not interested in keeping genetics that required intensive management when we were building a system designed to run the other way. I talked about this in episode 105, the connection between genetics and why people quit goats. When you have animals that have been intensively managed for generations, they often can't function well without that same intensive management. You've bred out the instinct they would have needed to function without it. And once we understood that, once we could see it in real time with our own herd, we were not interested in perpetuating it. The Spanish goats had shown us what was possible. An animal that does this on her own, that has the instincts, the mothering, the hardiness to kid on pasture and raise her kids without us engineering every step of the process. Once you've seen that, going back to the traditional management system feels like a choice to make your operation harder than it has to be. So we kept selecting. Every generation of Boers that we required pasture kidding of, they got better at it. The ones that struggled went on the cull list. The ones that figured it out stayed and bred on. Their daughters were better. The behavior reshapes when you require something different and then select for the animals that can do it. It is a slow process, but it is a real one. Where we are right now, the Spanish does still outperform the Boers on pasture kidding, but not by a lot. They're doing what they were built for. But the Boer herd is legitimately improving. It's a gap that's shrinking rapidly because we're breeding toward something different. And here's something I'm very proud of. We went from giving every kid a prophylactic dose of antibiotic to giving 0 prophylactic antibiotics. Not by finding a better drug protocol, not by adding more management steps or spending more hours in the barn, but by removing those things. The system changed, the genetics shifted, the behavior reshaped, and the goats are healthier for it. Not in spite of the fact that we're doing less, but because of it. And that's the end of part 1. Next week is episode 111, part 2, and that's where we get into the selection pressure side of this in more depth. What it actually looks like to move a herd in a new direction through culling and breeding decisions, and how long you realistically need to think about it taking. And part 3, episode 112, is the decision-making framework, how to look at your own operation, your own genetics, your business plan, and figure out what kidding system actually makes sense for where you are. See you next week. Hey there, thanks for listening today. If this episode was helpful, share it with another producer who's raising goats. And if you haven't already, leave a quick review on Apple Podcasts. It helps more serious livestock owners find the show. As always, this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for veterinary advice. I'll see you next week here on GoatWise.